I should say my background in this. I came to this a long time ago. I came to it from imperialism. So starting with, I wrote a book about how the U.S. tried to organize the post-war economy, what's called globalization now, but they were thinking about it during World War II. They were figuring out what, we're going to knock off the Germans and we're going to destroy the Japanese, we're going to have power, what are we going to do with it? And what they designed was what we call globalization. And so that's where I started, and I wrote a book about how they were going to enforce that, and part of that has to do with the bombing of Hiroshima, and I've written 2 books on that. So that's a long way of coming back to the system question, which is the current version, which has been, that we've been developing and refining this for these many years. I think the first essay I wrote on this was 1970, something like that. And so hopefully we've learned something since then, maybe. But we've been trying to develop it more because the time, I think, is really ripe for something interesting. People are ready for a conversation about changing the system, not only projects. You can't get there without projects. You can't get there without organizing. But the question of what is the next system, if you don't like capitalism, you don't like state socialism, what are you talking about? And that becomes a pressing question as soon as we move into deeper and deeper into politics. You got to do your projects, but what is it we're going for? And part of the Bernie discussion is the word socialism is possible, however you define that. So part and parcel of what we've been working on intensely, both on the ground and the Democracy Collaborative, but also how do you start, there's 2 levels of this, how do you start a legitimate conversation and a serious and thoughtful and deep conversation about, if you don't like capitalism, you don't like socialism, where are we going? And how do we make that part and parcel of our training and our education and our politics, so that when somebody asks you, what is this all about, we actually have a good answer rather than kind of slogans. And so there's a lot of work going on about this, and that's partly what I want to talk about today and get some reactions to. And we also have been developing a particular way of kind of talking about certain parts of this. So part of this is theory. What is it you want? What is it? What is the nature? And the question really becomes, this is a personal question. It's not just people like me. I think we're going to face, anybody who's doing serious organizing is going to face this question more and more and more. So a couple of introductory kind of concepts about that. Something like 40 to 45 to 50% of young people respond positively in polls now to the word socialism. That's a remarkable change in America. So the possibility of actually talking about something different is clearly underway. Now, there is going to be a big counterattack. You can, on that language, and in fact, you watch Paul Krugman now. He's going after this kind of he's trying to make it abstract foolishness and using numbers and attacking the base. But you're going to see, as it gets more and more powerful, we're going to see a counterattack. So knowing and having serious answers is what we're trying to develop in the serious wing and link it to organizing and project development simultaneously. I think part of this has to do with historical perspective. And the notion that we may be entering a period of history that genuinely, for the first time in American history, genuinely poses a systemic possibility. That this is a time when we may be moving into an era where the crisis is going to deepen and is deepening, and it's creating not only pain on the ground and not only need for projects, but also a whole challenge to the vision and ideology of the system at another level, that something's wrong here, something's going wrong, capitalism isn't working. The notion that a different system is necessary is growing as the crisis deepens. Now, the traditional models of state socialism leave a lot to be desired, because they started with centralization of power and they built strong power, and we don't have many examples of genuinely democratic socialism in the world. The only one we had was very short-lived, was Chile, and then it was eliminated. So we have in the Soviet Union, and we have a whole lot of examples of imposed imperial authoritarian, quote, socialism. They used the term, but they were essentially non-democratic systems. So we don't know much about this. So developing something, and I really want to make this clear, something very practical. No slogans. Tell me, I always think of I'm from Racine, Wisconsin. I always think of my high school buddies. Tell me how it works. I have a conservative old friend who I went to from kindergarten up. Very smart guy, very smart, very conservative, but also asks real questions. He says, well, how's that going to work? And if you don't have, I think we're entering a period when we need answers at a different level. And that's kind of what this is about. How do you talk about the system question in a different way? So that's the larger framing of it. And another way to, again, to put this in a different focus is, and why I think it's going to deepen and why these questions are going to be more and more not only on the table intellectually and politically, but we need to begin to answer them substantively, seeing work as building concretely towards different elements of a different vision. So that's a little bit trickier. Are you telling me we're going to begin in this coming period establishing things that are socialized but not centralized? Are you saying that there might be stepping stones institutionally as well as politically that build towards a next system, really? I mean really, not just projects. So I'm very much for projects. You can't get anywhere without projects. But I'm against projectism. My project is better than your project, or more important, that this is the only thing to do. And what part of this is how do we get a united vision over time that says this is the kind of direction that makes sense? Now that's going to require a lot of debate. And one of the really exciting things that's happening is there's a whole range of intellectual debate now opening up at a different level. That's one model. There are people talking about ecologically based systems that start at a different community or place-based systems. We're publishing this in the Next System project. I think 30 different models we've identified that people are beginning this debate at a different level. So that's an important thing at that level, and we need to begin informing ourselves about that. The other way of thinking about it is, and I want to sort of suggest this as context, and why this period, so let me say this carefully, why this period that we are entering, period of your lives, in my view, may be the most important period of American history, bar none, and I include the American Revolution. Now that's a pretty radical statement, that we may be entering the prehistory, the developmental history of a time when the system question for the first time is genuinely on the table. And if that's true, we need to get serious about, well, what the hell is it we're talking about? What do we really want? And how do projects relate to building towards something? So that's the context. And let me just sketch a little bit of that and why it's important. If you look at the development of American capitalism in the 20th century, we'll say a little bit about the 19th century, but not too much, there were growing economic crises and banking failures and financial failures in the first quarter of the century, deepening and deepening. And World War I bailed the system out with massive expenditures in the first quarter of the century. In the second quarter of the century, with decay in the 20s at many levels, particularly in agriculture, but also small farmers and small business and the financial system. It collapsed in the 30s, and World War II bailed it out. I'm not saying those wars were started for that reason. I'm saying that the reality is in the second quarter the system was bailed out by World War II. In the third quarter, first, we had destroyed the industrial base of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The major competitors was gone for a while until they came back. And there was huge economic spending on the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and military spending hit 14% of the GDP in 1953. And it went down. It's now going down, by the way, radically. It's very large in numbers, but it's only 3 to 4%, depending upon the year of the economy. It doesn't have as much economic power. But in the third quarter of the century, the system was stabilized through military spending again. Also, the competitors came back. Germany, Japan, Italy, so-called what we call globalization began to enter into the US economy. Meanwhile, the system domestically was stabilized even as it reached out for global and imperial forms elsewhere. What is really interesting about the period we're entering, military spending is very large, but a declining share of the economy. It's at the 4% range. It's a very, very big economy. So that managing the economy is going down, And now the globalization impact on the domestic economy is hitting, and there's beginning to be a reaction in many parts of the country, and we may stop the new trade agreement, possibly. We're just at the edge of that. So you're seeing a period where the things that stabilize the system are decaying, and the pain levels are growing, but the political system isn't able to manage the problem. That's what's really new in the 20th century. New in the 19th century also, but that's a whole other story. I mean, the way they managed the system in the 19th century is every time they got in problem, they kept taking over more land. Domestic, imperial destruction of native properties and stealing the land. It's the same thing as imperialism, only it was within the continent. What didn't have any water between the places they took. But they got to the end of the continent in the 19th century and then began going globally. But that's a whole other story. The important kind of takeaway at this point, at least from my point of view, is that the ways of managing the system are decaying before your eyes. They don't have a political capacity to put together coalitions to really run the system. That's why you're seeing stalemates in Congress and the incapacity to manage high employment rates and dealing with the environmental questions, not there. Part of that, and this is the second piece of the puzzle, which sets the context. Now, I think it's really important to establish the emerging, I put it this way, the emerging historical context, which permits and allows certain strategies and not others. So this context, which is, I sometimes put it this way, a context of stalemate and no collapse. Decay, but no resolution. Partly, and those of you who have a Marxist background, partly the notion that the capitalism will collapse is well developed both in Keynesian theory and in Marxist theory. But it always depended upon a major crisis. In 1929, the US government and state governments were 11% of the economy, only 11%. So when you had a collapse, the floor of government support was very weak, and you did have a major collapse. Government's now 30%, 32% of the economy. So you're entering a period in which the system most likely, we could go into this, does not collapse, but it doesn't succeed. It doesn't collapse and it doesn't succeed. It's a very unusual context in political theory and in political economy, because what it produces is disillusionment and pain and no solution, but not a collapse. If it collapsed, it would go to the right, not the left. And we'll come back to that. But I don't think we're having a collapse in that sense. What it is producing is people who are saying something's wrong here. This thing doesn't work. I'm getting screwed at all levels, in terms of libertarian right as well. And it's producing challenges where all of a sudden terms like socialism become unexpected to me, that people would vote 40 to 50% for Bernie Sanders calling himself a socialist. You don't know how big a deal that is in terms of history. That language has never been possible in any significant way, except way back in the early part of the 20th century. And it seems to wash easily, no problem. The number of people are talking that language, and there are several polls, often close to a majority saying favorable to the term socialism. Which means that whether you use the term socialism or not is not critical at this point. The language of changing the system in one major form or another is on the table. And that is a striking big deal change, because it opens the way for a very different kind of organizing and a different kind of politics for the first time in American history. I consider this period, so let me jolt you a little bit, I consider this period we're entering more important than the revolutionary period in 1776, because it's the first time the system's been on the table. So we don't want to blow it. Because the decay and disillusionment is real. And so then the question becomes, what is it you want? What is it that makes sense? How do we actually, it's like a funny word for it, it's like an architecture problem. What is the architecture of the next system that, if you had it and if you built it, would produce equality, ecological sustainability, anti-imperialist structure, liberty? The left never talks about liberty in terms of institutions. How do you build liberty into the model? How do you build community? What is the nature of a system that we could think about and talk about in non-rhetorical terms that actually would achieve the values we want. And if you can't do that, why in the world should we listen to you when you talk about changing the system? It's a really good question. Why in the world should anybody listen to you? Say, change the system. We want social. Well, what does it mean? I'm not sure. You know, that's what people do because we haven't thought it through. And so I'm suggesting that it is politically important. It's morally important as well, to begin to get a serious developmental conversation about what is the nature of what we want. And because of the emerging context, emerging on the table. And the second question, and this is partly whether or not this makes sense to you, I want to get some feedback, that it is important for us to develop these ideas and begin to demonstrate what we're doing is not only projects, and not only important at the project level, but it may have a pathway forward in this next 2-3 decades as we move through this quarter century to establish, let me say this very carefully, to establish the irreversible conditions of a fundamental systemic transformation. So I didn't say we change the entire system. I said if we knew where we were going, we might be able to establish the fundamental conditions, irreversible, upon which a true transformation could be accomplished. And so I see this period of development that we're entering as both having political trajectories, on the ground trajectories of activism and institution building directions and idea directions. Institution building, so for instance, the basis of any system traditionally is who owns the property. I mean, that's the central systemic question throughout history. In the medieval times, it was the lords and the church and the king. They had the land and they controlled the game. I'm oversimplifying, but not very much. In 19th century capitalism, it was in fact significantly small-scale capitalism, entrepreneurial capitalism. That's a different model, and most of them are farmers. Most people don't really recognize the simple point. Farmers are small entrepreneurial business people. There's a lot of halo about farming and agriculture, and there's a different kind of feel about it. But the name of the game is to produce for the market and be subjected to the market and have capital investment for the market as an independent businessman. That model is clearly out of the game and was over by the end of the 19th century, largely. Those of you who are oriented towards imperial problems, the new research shows not only did the major corporations at the end of the 19th century begin moving the imperial takeover, it was the farmers for markets who were backing the politics for global markets of American agricultural products, and they still play a role, and some of you know what's going on in agriculture globally. So partly imperialism took that form as both corporate and financial, but also it had a base in the farmers who really needed those markets. Well, the farmers at that point were the majority. Let me put that carefully. The farm business people, they were all businessmen, or women, not many women, but many, they were subordinated, they were part of the team, supported that, but they're gone. They're less than 1% of the workforce now in the United States. So it was a majority country of small business people, and it's now down 1 to 2%, depends how you look at the numbers. So that system is over, and what you've got is the dominant corporate system that's playing a significant role. Anyway, that model is one model of running a system, and here's the first step is and this was the idea. The idea was if you spread out capital ownership among small business people, they would preserve liberty. That was a genuine conservative idea. It wasn't a bad one. That wasn't crazy. At least it wasn't giant corporations, and they believed people were independent. The farmers would stand on their own feet. That model is over. The only competing models we've seen are corporate-dominated capitalism and really totalitarian, so far, state socialism. The intermediate model, and here's the other piece of the analysis, for all this is starting point, we're just kind of winding up to get to the system design, but it's really important. What we ended up with and what most of the advanced industrial systems ended up with in the midpoint of the 20th century was a model of corporate capitalism partly balanced by politics. Social Security, for instance, was produced. And that depended ultimately on another institution, which was labor unions. So the current model that is dying before your eyes was corporate dominated, but it was countervailed, that's John Kenneth Galbraith's term, by an institution as well as politics. And the institution was the labor movement. The labor unions had money and organizational power. They peaked at 34.3% of the labor force membership in 1953. They are now down to 11%, 6% in the private sector, and declining. So the basis of the old system, which was corporate dominated, but countervailed, they called it social democracy in Europe, here it was called liberalism, and always a very weak system here compared with, the Swedes had 85% of the people in the labor force countervailing. That whole model is decaying all over the world, and particularly here, and it's opening up all the pain and difficulty because there's no replacement model until we produce ours. But nonetheless, some of the dangers of that model are institutional design dangers. Am I getting through on this stuff? Because I want to focus how these systems are essentially based on models of institutional power. And again, in the case of capitalist systems, the drive to expand for profits, which leads, on the one hand, to climate problems, and the other hand, to global imperialism, because you need those markets and you need finance. So that's the dynamic, and those are the institutions, and that's what's decaying. That they no longer command, Hillary's amazed, they no longer command full control of the idea system. People don't believe something's wrong here. We don't know what it is, but something's really wrong here. We'll even vote for a socialist, whatever that means. And that's what we want to get to, whatever that means. But, so I want to switch it to the level of ideology here. The question of when a system of ideas loses its capacity to command allegiance, which is what we're living through. When a system of ideas no longer holds belief that people actually believe this is working, that's a big deal. That's a big deal. Really big deal. And it's what I think, why I think this is the most important period of American history, bar none, because that hasn't happened before in depth. So then it becomes our responsibility, I think, both to build projects that open up new dimensions, but also to begin to develop a really sophisticated argument about why this might add up if we thought more about it, and if we got serious, towards a systemic design that we could actually talk about rather than rhetoric. If you want to talk about changing the system, and you want to talk to people who aren't radicals or aren't activists, because they are the majority, they ask reasonable questions. There's a lot of people who don't ask reasonable questions. There's political hacks and there's ideologues and all that. But people, I always think of my hometown, Racine, which is a dying industrial town of about 80,000. They ask reasonable questions. Well, how would that work? And would that be good? And how are you going to do that? And we don't have good answers in many cases. We have slogans and rhetoric. And we certainly don't have a pathway outlined. How would we actually I'd like to put it this way, throw the next quarter century on the table. How would we actually lay I'm going to say this carefully, lay the irreversible foundations, I didn't say achieve, for a fundamental transformation? How would we do that? So part of that, and a good part of that, and here's kind of the next step, is obviously systems are based on property. How would you democratize property? How do you change the ownership of property in a way that didn't produce a totalitarian centralized system? Now, what's interesting is that's happening. What's happening is worker co-ops are happening, for instance, but there's a lot of that going on around the country, developing of worker co-ops, and you're seeing the second step of this in institutional design. Let me parenthesize about worker co-ops. Worker co-ops, people like worker co-ops. And I like worker co-ops. But the history of worker co-ops, even in the best cases that we know about, that the Mondragon, how many people know about Mondragon in the Basque region of Spain? Everybody knows about it. And Emilia-Romagna in Italy. Those are the best cases so far. of freestanding worker co-ops. In the Mondragon case, which is the most interesting of all, it never got to more than 4% of the workforce, and ran into economic problems because it has no planning system. Let me say that again. The Mondragon is up against the world market, and the world market is brutal. And the world market will chop you down unless you have a state behind you. And they don't have a state behind them. So you can learn a lot from Mondragon, but it can also be romanticized. And it's that in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy, 5% of the workforce, max. In all of Spain, number of people in worker co-ops, 1% of the labor force, never got beyond that. In all of Italy, 3%. So I'm very much for worker co-ops and worker ownership, but I want to suggest to you that we're going to have to either tell ourselves a story about why there is a way to make a society of entire worker co-ops, facing the reality in much more radical contexts, or we're going to have to develop other models, or we're going to have a both and. So I'm in the both and camp. I started out seeing worker ownership as a critical model, and it is critical. But in many places, I think it's radically overemphasized in terms of what we can accomplish that way, simply by looking objectively at how it works. Also, there is often decay. Worker owners sometimes become very conservative. My co-op is better than yours, or more important, I'm under market pressure. I got to cut back, and I might have to pollute a little bit, but the next guy's doing it, and I can't pay. If I pay the cost of environmental protection, he's going to win. So they're in a market. So as an advocate of worker ownership in many areas, I think it's really important to be skeptical also, not be romantic. So what is it? The next level of worker ownership, who owns the property, is always the question in these various visions. Another form, how many know about evergreen? Does evergreen mean? So let me sketch evergreen for you, but an evergreen's only a primitive model in some ways. Evergreen is a neighborhood structure, 40,000 people in a very poor neighborhood of Cleveland, in which there are worker-owned cooperatives, but they are part of a neighborhood structure, subordinated to a neighborhood structure, a nonprofit corporation. So that means that they aren't just freestanding, they have some responsibility to a neighborhood. And how that is defined, we'll see. There are other models emerging, but at least they are supported, and if they make a profit, in theory, they kick in something to the center so you can start more with a loan fund, and if they make a real profit, the money can go to the neighborhood, which is a community vision, not just a worker ownership vision. So the neighborhood or a community is a broader concept politically. And to the extent you build a model that has a community base, you may also be able to build a politics around it. But the notion, and that's what I'm going to underline it, is a community model of worker ownership supporting and nurturing a larger context. But to the extent you build that model, you've got the possibility of building political power around something that benefits the community rather than just small businesses. Co-ops are small businesses right now. So I want to throw that out as something to think about because of its political power potential, organizing the neighborhood if they get benefits, in support of a model that also has ownership. So that's an interesting design. Second part of the design, which is even more interesting, is in this model, and I'm going to go beyond Cleveland, but Cleveland's interesting because it's really broken through to a new level. In this model, there are also big public, quasi-public institutions in the middle. This is a very poor neighborhood, 40% unemployment, average income around $20,000 per family. It's mostly black. Also, the Cleveland Clinic, another big hospital called University Hospitals, and Case Western Reserve University are right in the middle of that place. They purchase $3 billion, with a B, in goods and services a year. That's aside from their salaries, which is another huge amount, and aside from their construction, just what they buy. So part of that funding, a lot of it taxpayer money, healthcare money. The model is a community model which might build political power linked to the purchasing power of quasi-publicly funded institutions. Planning, so we buy from them. We take our laundry there, we buy our greens. One of the models, one of the largest greenhouse urban greenhouse in the country is one of the co-ops or structures. Another one is one of the most advanced ecologically industrial scale laundries. And a third is a solar installation company right now on the ground. But the interesting part is the purchasing power of institutions. This is really central. Financed by public money to support a collective form based on democratic ownership in a community is a decentralized socialist planning model. Let me say that again. The market is not determining, to the degree there is purchasing power, and all these models are complex and never perfect. To the degree you're using public funds to stabilize decentralized community ownership with worker self-management and joint ownership, the public money stands in the place of the market. They are not fighting just for market control in a capitalist market. This is a socialist planning system. We don't call it that, but that's what a planning system is when the money is managed through public or quasi-public use, but in this case, in the interest of community and in the interest of a complex community, worker ownership within a community structure. That's a big advance in terms of systemic design. We haven't seen that yet, where you use public planning running through these big institutions, they wouldn't call it that, and stabilizing a new model which transforms the ownership of capital in a community. There's a lot of problems with the Cleveland model. It's not very democratic, it's a startup, it's got very great, we can go through all the problems. But what I want to focus on is the intellectual and architectural design as one component. Now, if you want to do it big, when next time there's a big crisis and we nationalize General Motors and Chrysler again, and we then say, why would they not be owned by communities and the region, perhaps? And why would we not spend a lot of money on mass transit and high-speed rail and use that money to stabilize the worker community-owned industrial structure? So you can just amplify this whole mini sketch, and you have a systemic design that is both decentralized, but also uses the power of the state to stabilize the market and get it out of the capitalist market so that you can have stability. So that's a model. And if you think about that model, and it's one of many, but what the criteria become, and in this case, this is the greenest laundry, and I think one of the greenest laundries in the country, and it has a very powerful ecological vision throughout its solar installation. To what degree can we build in models that take us from worker co-ops, which is common, and land trusts, which many people are working with at the local level, to models that begin to amplify visions of this kind in the larger scale? That's a model that begins to take you to systemic design. And it's one we've been working with a lot. It's a very imperfect model. There's a lot of things about it that are not perfect, even if you developed it fully. So for instance, the conservatives had a really good theory of liberty. And it's important to reckon it. They said if a man stands on his own land, he can be independent of the state. Screw you, I'm here. And that was a really important idea. And it's gone. So this model doesn't have that. So how would we augment a model like this, perhaps in our model, with sort of guaranteed job standing or guaranteed income so that people actually had stability of income, not only because they need it, but because it's the only way you can have independent liberty in the only place you see this, you want to have liberty, in most places, although it's decaying, the traditional model with small businesses. Stand on the small business, you can stand up to the state. The two models that are available now are the tenure system. If you're a college professor and you have tenure in most universities, you can say anything you want and they can't fire you. Maybe. It's decaying. Well, it's decaying. But it is one of the few places you see guaranteed job. And you can do what you want, mostly. That's a basis for liberty. A true institutional base. That's much better than a small business base, because that's a very insecure base. The other way you can do that, the other way you can do it is guaranteed income. A lot of people are talking about some basic guaranteed income, and they talk about it as a nice way to provide income. I'm suggesting that we in our vision of the future, begin to see that as a way to provide a basis for liberty as well. Because if you don't have income, you ain't got no liberty. So that's another way to get at it. And the third way, and now we're moving into further design questions, I'm sorry about that. If you want real liberty, the question becomes, do you have any time? Do you have time to do what you want to do? I know a lot of people working 2 jobs, if they can get them. How would you build time as a guaranteed, I mean, the labor movement produced the 40-hour week. It used to be an 80-hour week. To get 40 hours of liberty was the goal of the labor movement. In some countries, they're trying to go to 32. But it's usually seen as a good thing to have free time, but it's also a way to get political liberty. If you got that time, you can participate in politics. But if you don't have that time, you can't do it. So stability becomes part of the model that we need to talk about. Actually thinking about how we build security into the next model, and time, part of it. Parentheses. The US economy today, leaving aside its future path, it produces over $200,000 for every family of 4. It is a very, very rich system. Now, the distribution is radically off. So how do we begin thinking about a system that could actually stabilize jobs, community by community by community by community, and also begin allocating time as a way to produce liberty and security? You can do that if you can manage the planning system. You just redistribute the jobs and the hours. So I think we are at the place that this is part of a much larger discussion going on around the country of how that also, if you could stabilize production through planning, you can then also deal much better with ecological issues. Because the system has, currently the way in which these systems are run is they must grow. Let me say that again. Capitalist systems have to grow. Otherwise, they can't get any financing. And they certainly, the big ones, can't go to Wall Street to get money unless they can show a growth path that has more and more profits. And the only way you do that now is to cut labor down and cut environmental regulations down. So they've got to do it. That's the nature of the systemic design. So if I'm talking about planning and changing ownership, I want to stress that we're after the logic of the system. And the systems that we know about have a logic, and we'll come back to state socialism under authoritarian control, have a logic that must grow both imperially and ecologically, destructively. Otherwise, they can't get financed. They can't go to Wall Street and get money unless they can say, well, we're going to grow at this rate every year. So a system that doesn't, like this little sketch I gave you of Cleveland, doesn't require them to grow because it's got a stable market. You don't have to go to Wall Street. So that's one way of thinking about a planning system that begins to maximize across ecological issues as well as economic issues. So I want to sketch some of these on the table, but what's important, one of the things that is common to almost all of the new models lives in the realm of practice and ideology. And that is, can we get democratic ownership and control of wealth rather than corporate and private control? Because if you can't get democratic control of wealth, they run the game. So I'm going to switch gears right now. How do we, in the current period, build up the idea, let me say this real carefully, as a conscious political act, build the idea that democratic ownership of wealth is possible and necessary and practical? Because that's the heart of all the socialist systems, one form or another. And what we're seeing is, I was talking about co-ops and worker-owned companies and the Cleveland model and so forth. I'll tell you about several other models which you probably know about. What they have in common is, hey, this is how you democratize wealth ownership that I can talk to my friend Tony in Racine about. What are you talking about? Well, look at what's on the ground. This is practical. It doesn't scare you, does it? It's real. And by the way, it's better. It's more equitable. And we're beginning to see that principle, not in theory, but in practice, emerging in many parts of the country. Like, there are more and more cities setting up public banks. There are land trusts, neighborhood ownership of land. There are worker co-ops. There are complex worker co-ops. There are et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we're beginning to put together the elements that can allow us to talk about a different vision, not in radical rhetoric, but in something on the ground you can point to that, what if we did that at a larger scale? That's what we're talking about. And that kind of way of looking at it is part and parcel of this. So that's step one in the discussion of the context in which we're living and the beginning elements that might allow us to talk about a model and possibly a politics to enforce the model.